We're now going to commence our last session, and I'll just tell you a quick anecdote from the last few days. Robert Olds rang me about 2 days ago and said to me, "I'm worried we haven't got enough speakers." I said, "Oh, don't worry, Robert, you know, the speakers we've got are top quality, and they're going to go on, and they're going to make their points, and they're going to deal with all the questions, and we may just have 6 speakers, but this is going to fill at least 6 hours." And fortunately, I know my customers, and I knew that the speakers we've got were going to come up with really very, very solid material, and I thought that all of you would enjoy it, and there'd be a lot of questions. And we've had a lot of questions, and we haven't needed more speakers, because everything our panel has said has been deeply, deeply thought about by each of them, and I certainly know that is the case with Bill Cash. Now, I just want to say a few remarks about, this has been a very long journey. I want to make a few remarks about where we've been and where we should be going. It's all Anthony's fault. These were Edward Heath's words to me in the early hours of a dark morning in January 1993, some 30 years ago. I had been in Parliament for 6 months, and Heath had been in Parliament for 41 years and had been leader of the Conservative Party for about 10. But we had this conversation in the middle of the night, and I'd just like to speak about this. I'd just taken a break from debating the Maastricht Treaty in the chamber of the House of Commons. I went to the smoking room, and there, sitting alone, was our former Prime Minister, and the man who in 1973 had taken Britain into the so-called common market. I offered to buy Ted a drink. He replied, "Yes, make mine a Glenmorangie." I obliged. Ted sipped his whiskey, thank you for that, good prompt. Ted sipped his whiskey, looked me in the eye, and pronounced, "It's all Anthony's fault." I knew exactly what he meant, but unfortunately, not even I could agree with him with the conclusion of my newfound drinking companion. To Ted, the difficulties that we then faced in our relationship with the European Union were due to the fact that the establishment of the single currency meant it was no longer possible to deny the federalist intent. All he could do was attribute to Prime Minister Anthony Eden the failure to send British representatives to the Messina Conference in 1956, when this all began. There, continental Europe's leading powers determined upon a plan to create the seductively named Common Market, a title which sought to disguise the true federalist intent of Monet and his associates. Ted failed to convince me that Eden had blundered. The Messina Conference was likely to have come to the same conclusions even if Britain had been represented there. In reality, Anthony was merely following the strategy of his predecessor, Winston Churchill, when in May 1953, just a few days before the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, he had told the House of Commons, "We are with Europe, but not of it." And earlier still, he had enunciated that if the choice is between Europe and the open sea, we must always choose the open sea. Looking back, I think it's remarkable that by 1993, Edward Heath, the architect of our EU membership, was privately prepared to concede that the project, which had consumed a large part of his political life, was indeed deeply flawed as far as Britain's membership was concerned. Even successor Macmillan, unnerved by the US Secretary of State Dean Acheson's tag that Britain had lost an empire but had not found a role, Macmillan had by 1960 abruptly changed course and decided the decline in Britain's global standing could be increased by common market membership. Indeed, as a schoolboy, this was my first involvement with the issue, which has devoured so much of my political energies over a lifetime. I was required to write an essay addressing Dean Acheson's proposition that Britain had lost an empire and not found a role. After Suez and Britain's desire to remain a nuclear power, Macmillan now assigned the role of the United Kingdom to be the Greeks in a Roman Empire, represented by US leadership of the Western world. Macmillan appointed his fellow Balliol man, Edward Heath, as Britain's negotiator-in-chief. Macmillan and Heath hoped that British membership of the common market could boost Britain's growth rates to equal those of continental Europe. But they overlooked the bountiful Marshall aid that Germany in particular had received from a United States determined that American lives would never again be sacrificed in a European conflict. Macmillan failed in his endeavour, vetoed by de Gaulle, ever eager to avenge the many perceived humiliations meted out to France during the Second World War. Labour's Wilson turned from sceptic to enthusiast when the white heat of the technological revolution failed to ignite. However, at last, in 1973, Prime Minister Heath managed to convince French President Pompidou that Britain would accept the provisions of the Treaty of Rome in the hope that membership of the Customs Union would provide an elixir for the British economy. However, the monetary boom that Heath and his Chancellor Tony Barber had created to ease out membership of the Customs Union created an inflationary blizzard, with the public sector unions determined that their members should be fully recompensed. Heath's Who Governs Britain general election ended with the answer, not you. Britain's post-war problems could not be cured by joining a customs union. The size of the state and its deference to trade union power were handicaps that had to be confronted full on. The post-war Attlee government had landslided on the concept of building a new Jerusalem, created by a bigger state, and no subsequent Conservative government felt entirely comfortable in implementing trade union reform and indeed shrinking the size of the state. Britain was desperately in need of economic growth, but that could only really be advanced through real reform of trade union power and the curtailment and shrinkage of the role of the state linked to a stable monetary policy. By the 1980s, under the leadership of Margaret Thatcher, Britain finally embraced that strategy and went from success to success. In Bruges in 1989, Thatcher uttered the immortal words, "We have not rolled back the frontiers of the state, merely to have them reimposed at a European level." The conflict between the free market approach that the UK had now embarked upon and the benefits that were being reaped was in marked contrast to the strategy of the European Union, clinging to the outdated concept of a customs union and an ever-expanding acquis communautaire. Given the history of the United Kingdom and the European Union over the previous 25 years, the Bruges speech might be regarded as a statement of the obvious. The most remarkable feature of Bruges was that virtually the entire British establishment rejected Thatcher's conclusions. Free market economics and rolling back the frontiers of the state in a way which conflicted with the agenda of the European Union were not objectives favoured by Howe, Heseltine, Major, Hurd, Kinnock, Blair, Brown and Ashdown, along with the entire upper echelons of the British civil service. Now this began a 27-year argument between the British establishment and those who attach the highest priority to self-government and free markets. I would like to say the argument was settled in the referendum of 2016. But after nearly 8 years, it's still clear that those that consider themselves part of the dominant Remain establishment do not accept the judgment of the majority of the British people. I'm afraid that much of this is about elitism and the refusal of the governing class, in the widest sense in this country, to accept that experience should change many assumptions upon which their judgments were originally based. No one should rationally believe in today's world that a customs union between some of the most mature economies in the world is likely to enhance significantly the prosperity of its citizens. The European Union's share of world trade has and continues to contract materially. Back in the early 1970s, the negotiations were presented as being about joining an economic entity known as the Common Market. With the UK inside the EEC, it would represent over a quarter of world output. And so joining was presented as being about the UK gaining access to the world's largest economic association. The reality was that the European Union did not fulfill its promise to evolve into the world's economic powerhouse. At the end of the 1970s, its share of world output was over 30%. Now it is down to a comparable rate of just under 15%. Demographic projections imply that the pattern of decline will indeed persist over the next 50 years. If we assume that the rate of decline is the same as in the 4 decades from 1980, on that basis, by 2027, my great-grandchildren, your grandchildren, will be neighbours of a European superstate that accounts for a mere 7% of world output. Rejoining the EU would be a folly beyond most people's imagination. We would be truly part of a United States of Europe, having to comply with its rules, regulations and laws. And let me be quite clear about this. In the long run, our own Parliament would be defunct, and we would be part of an increasingly diminutive Europe. Since leaving the EU, the government has taken one step of huge potential significance. It has joined the Comprehensive Trade and Progression Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TTP. This partnership has 11 members and represents 13% of world output. Over half of its 11 members are part of the Commonwealth, and it is no intention of harmonising laws and regulations like the EU. The potential for growth amongst these countries far exceeds anything the sclerotic European Union could possibly achieve. Some of you may remember Project Fear, backed by Treasury forecasts. The then Chancellor of the Exchequer, you remember him, George Osborne, predicted an immediate recession if the British people voted to leave, and an 18% fall in house prices. The Prime Minister, David Cameron, you must remember him, he flounced out of Downing Street, unwilling to play a part in carrying out the wishes of the British people, and then spent £25,000 on a garden shed in which to wail away his time. Delighted to have the opportunity to be Foreign Secretary in Brexit Britain. Ladies and gentlemen, those of us that voted leave and understand the true objectives of the EU must continue to pressure the government to take full advantage of Brexit and impress upon the majority of the British people that there will be no turning back. Now, before I turn to Bill, with whom I've had a long association, I would briefly like to pay tribute to someone else that I have had an even longer association with, and that is Professor Tim Condren. I hope that Tim would be here today, but he's trying very hard to finish writing a book. Tim has brilliantly analysed the economic failings of the European Union. But he is also, I believe, the country's leading authority on monetary policy, the setting of interest rates. During the 1970s and 1980s, monetary policy was erratic, to say the least, and our country suffered because of that. Tim was a prominent critic, and I followed these arguments very closely. In my only term in Parliament, I was elected to be chairman of the Treasury Select Committee. Although a committed Thatcherite, I was unanimously elected. In particular, I had the support of the left-wing Labour MP, Brian Sedgwick. When I asked Brian, "Why are you backing me?" as we disagree about nearly every economic policy, Brian replied, "It's because you will guarantee the independence of the committee. There is no chance that our reports will be influenced by the Whip's office." During my time on the committee, we managed to secure a unanimous report that recommended independence for the Bank of England. However, the major government failed, as it did with really every major measure, to endorse that report. Instead, Blair and Brown got tremendous kudos from implementing this change on immediately winning the 1997 general election. The change worked very well to begin with, but of late, the Bank of England has fallen subject to groupthink, and now has a frankly hopeless governor. In the form of Andrew Bailey. Now, Mr. Bailey was chairman of the left-leaning Fabian Society at Cambridge University. He doesn't actually have any economic qualifications. He got a very good degree in history. I got a good degree in history. I think Bill got a degree in history as well. So there's something in his favour, but I've taken various financial qualifications since I did my degree in history. It's a great subject, etc. He's also tried his hand at being a financial regulator, and I'm afraid that didn't work very well at all. And he came back to the Bank of England. Now, many journalists are guarded in their criticisms of Mr. Bailey, as he has an 8-year tenure. He's been a contract for 8 years. Wow. We all wish we could get 8-year contracts. The consequence of this for our government, and more importantly the British people, is that we are having to cope, in my opinion, and the opinion of a leader